We were going into the office that morning to pitch IHG, and I could not physically get up. My alarm went off. I tried. I lost my legs. I fell on the floor. I stood up at the mirror and I had a blood blister that had burst in my eye. So my entire eye was red. And I started getting very sick.
Chances are you've gone to college, got a very respectable degree and job, yet you're not satisfied in your current career. Something needs to change. I'm career coach Dr. Steve Oiley, host and creator of Escape the 9 to 5. I help other working professionals like you take the next steps in their career and design a career that works for them. How many people do you know overworking themselves? They look busy, they seem successful, and yet inside, they're often crashing and burning. You want to be a success in your career, but are you starting to question what success even means to you? Because society's definition of success doesn't seem to be correlating with satisfied professionals, happy marriages, and balanced lives. In fact, I started to question this not only in my own life, but seeing many people I knew getting sucked into the external definition of success, only to be complaining about their jobs, deeply unhappy, and even seeing relationships suffer as a result. I got curious. What makes for a meaningful career, and who are these people achieving it? How have people escaped the 9 to 5 with a smile on their face, and how have they done it? My life's mission is to help working professionals like you take the next steps in their professional lives and design a career that works for you. And part of that mission is interviewing some of the most interesting career changes on the planet, top career coaches, as well as regular people like you and me, who went from a standard career and decided to walk the path less travelled. Today's guest is a walking case study on what happens when we chase external success, but it doesn't match who we are on the inside. She is, in her own words, a corporate dropout, a recovering codependent, people pleaser. She was a very successful professional in the advertising industry, only to get burnt out to the point she couldn't get out of bed. It made her ask the question most of us ask at some point in our professional lives: is this really it? You'll learn how Western society has got our measure of success so wrong, what she suggests we do instead, and I'll give you one simple challenge you can do today to help on your own career journey. But before we do that, a quick message. Thank you for being a fan of the show. If you're enjoying this show and finding it valuable in your career, go ahead and hit the follow button on whatever app you're listening on. This helps the show in more ways than you know, and the bigger the show grows, the better experience you will get. You're listening to Escape the 9 to 5. Don't listen to this podcast at work, and whatever you do, don't tell your boss.
I had an 18-year career in corporate marketing and advertising. So I worked for some of the world's biggest ad agencies, such as BBDO, on some of the largest brands, Deloitte, Coca-Cola, the Home Depot, which is a US, North American brand.
Yes.
And I did soup to nuts, everything, right, as it related to being involved in the business side, the brand strategy, creative development, advertising. I mean, you name it. And I was on for advertising marketing for these brands. These are not small brands. And one of our favorite sayings in advertising is nobody's going to die, right? Because in advertising, there is this mentality because you're always up against like publication deadlines and trying to get spots to air on time and digital campaigns going live at the very right moment, right? And everything just has this sense of urgency that until recently, I didn't even realize is so astronomically out of alignment with the way that the brain leverage creativity, right? So we're working in this highly creative environment where we're supposed to be breaking through the mess in this very busy, very loud world. but we're doing so in a way that all of the energy is sucked out of you, right? You're checking off of a to-do list instead of becoming inspired by going on a walk, right? I got on the executive track very quickly. I had a big voice and a lot of opinions and a lot of thoughts, and that gets noticed in advertising. And so before I knew it, I was doing all of the things I was supposed to do. I went to college, I went and got a postgraduate degree, I got a great job straight out of graduate school. And then I spent the next, I'll say at this point, 12 to 13 years just grinding 70 to 8 hour work weeks. And in about 2018, I woke up one day in a full-fledged panic attack. And I, for the first time, recognized that I had been living a life that I felt fundamentally was not successful unless I was losing my mind, right? Busy, overbooked, on the phone, you're listening to a podcast, reading a book, walking the dog. It's just, there was no time and space for everything. And I woke up and I realized, I asked myself the question, whose life is this? Whose life am I living? Because it seemed like from graduating college to in my early 30s, having this epiphany and waking up, there wasn't even time to think. It was just go, 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 go. And my physical ailments, my physical health started to decline at a fast rate after years and years and years of not paying attention to my mental health.
I want to go back to something you said about, that sort of busyness and that working hard and long hours and stuff and how it effectively isn't great for creativity. I find
Mm,
it so funny that I understand say a CEO of an advertising agency is going to be the sort of workaholic personality type. But if they want the best for their business, and this applies to so many different businesses, not just marketing, is if they want the best for their business, their creatives should probably only work 30 hours a week and just be
mhm.
given the freedom to go for long walks and to meditate and do all that because, as you've probably discovered yourself, your best ideas and most creative moments don't come on those 12 or 14-hour days. They come when you've rested and you're just randomly walking in the bush, or you're going for a swim and you just have this epiphany moment, and that's where the greatest ideas come from. And of course, very relevant to marketing, but I think there's so many jobs where we've just forgotten that not every job needs to be a slog. And I think it potentially, I mean, maybe it comes back from our agricultural roots, because back then, genuinely, the person that worked that long 14, 16-hour day, probably it was the beneficial thing in that environment. But there's so many working environments now where it's actually not the best thing, and it's ironically counterproductive. So not only do you not get the best out of your employees, they also end up miserable, they end up burnt out, they end up quitting their jobs.
That's right. And what I think is so interesting is that there's so little awareness in general discussion about the idea that a lot of us in today's ecosystem are what we call knowledge workers. And that means that we have to use our brains, right? So what you just referenced with somebody years ago that was working 14 hours in a field, that worked for them because that physical labor was what they needed to invest, right? And we know that
Yes.
physical power can withstand mental power. Whereas now, because of, let's call it the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right? And then that kind of transported into the digital revolution, all of which are based on efficiencies, moving faster, and productivity. But then there was a transition to this concept of the knowledge worker, and those are the creatives, right? Those are the analysts, the people that really have to sit down and focus in order to break through on a significant problem. And these people make up the vast majority of today's workforce. We didn't right size that ever. So we didn't think about how the physical and the emotional and mental would impact each other when laid on top of each other. So you've got thought workers, you've got knowledge workers like I was that are meant, or creatives, designers that are not only leveraging the, let's call it the 30 hours a week for that deep consideration, that imagination, tapping into things that don't currently exist, right? The thing that makes evolution happen, but we didn't take down their to-do lists to make time for that, because productivity is the name of the game. And what I find so interesting is, at what point did we flip to having a walk be a luxury, to stepping away from your desk to eat lunch? That's a luxury in today's, workforce. And we're talking about like very, very foundational things and tasks needed for human function.
It's such a basic thing. And what's fascinating is I've come from a background where one of my jobs was as a large animal veterinarian, where a lot of the work that I did, while there was, I guess, a little bit of knowledge to it, a lot of it was actually quite physical.
Mhm.
And I was in my mid 20s working long hours, and I could actually handle that because it was like physical, and you were sort of like in this environment, this busy environment, but it wasn't so much like thinking all the time. However, when I became a companion animal vet and I was doing like even an 8 hour day of just consult after consult after consult after consult and using your brain the entire time, I found that far more exhausting. And now
Mhm.
running my own business, I have to say I've grown up in an environment where hard work was praised, and I'm still learning to sort of step back and realize that, a 6 hour day where you've like done 3 hours of work, taken a long lunch, really like meditated, relaxed, done another 3 hours of work, and then, you know, realize that your energy's done, especially when I'm doing sort of the bigger picture thought work for my business, is actually more productive than getting up at 6 a.m., starting work at 6:30 and smashing out 12 hours. It just
Mhm.
doesn't work like that when you're doing that sort of bigger picture, that creativity, that strategic thinking, all that sort of, I guess, as you put it, knowledge work.
Mhm. And then on top of that, if you're in an industry that requires any kind of an emotional investment, which I will tell you, people don't think this, but advertising does. You have people putting their most raw ideas in front of a room full of critics every day. The pride, the thing that it took
Mm.
them weeks to develop and curate. And they put so much emotion into their work. As a coach, I sit with a client and I give them 100% of me, my energy, my attention, my affection, my empathy. And after 1 hour, I am depleted. So it's not even just the thought work on top of the manual labor, but then it's the emotion and the pride that goes on top of that. How in the world are any of us sitting up straight?
One thing you'll gather from listening to Laura is she has a lot of energy. She's a bubbly personality and genuinely one of the most interesting guests I've interviewed in 4 years of podcasting. How could someone as bubbly, outgoing, and happy a personality as Laura end up burnt out to the point she couldn't get out of bed?
I was actually at the time doing several ad campaigns for IHG, which is a global hotel company. And I remember we had a major pitch. I had been up for several nights in a row with the creative teams, and we were trying to create a new global campaign for Holiday Inn. We were going into the office that morning to pitch IHG, and I could not physically get up. My alarm went off. I tried. I lost my legs. I fell on the floor. I stood up at the mirror and I had a blood blister that had burst in my eye. So my entire eye was red. And I started getting very sick. And I remember my partner at the time recognized this. And I had been very stressed for days and days and days, weeks leading up to this major pitch. And he said, I'm going to call into work. I remember this is maybe too much, but I remember the moment of like being physically sick and him helping me to get dressed because I was pitching and I had to be the one at the meeting to give it. It did not matter, come hell or high water. So I remember, he's like helping me to get dressed while I'm just getting physically sick. And, that seems like such a, you know, it was beyond a wake up call, right? Like I had let myself get so far down the line. So at that time, and I think this comes down to what a lot of people face with burnout is it gets to a point where it's all just too much. The basis of burnout is overwhelm, right? And continuing to just say yes because you're not at all taking time to think about what you need in that moment to do your best work or to show up for your partner or to be a good parent. You're just trying to get it all done. So that aha moment for me was, there's kind of a phrase that I'm not going to get right, but it's like if you don't listen to your body will tell you, a terrible variation of it. But, my body shut down on me after, at this point, probably 15 or 16 years in this industry of
Mm.
going. And what I recognized is I actually had to go basically become an inpatient. I had to slow down. I had to basically come to a stop because I had overworked myself to the point where, again, my brain wasn't in control. My body was saying, "We're done."
Mm.
And really, then I kind of got my brave face on and prepared myself. And after a sabbatical of a few weeks, went back to work, and then the global pandemic hit. And that, unfortunately, in advertising, though some budgets were removed, that was a time where we were asked to be as creative as possible, come up with the next biggest ideas, right? Because these brands were worried about the pandemic and what they were doing. So while I would love to say that I rolled sabbatical straight into pandemic and got the rest that I needed, no, I rolled sabbatical right back around into the exact same environment that I was in. And then I spent another 3 or 4 years until this past year when I finally just said enough is enough, trying
Mhm.
to find a middle ground.
Yeah.
But it was so far beyond that it just really it wasn't going to be repaired until it was an all in stop and reassessment. It was the first time I'm at 36, 37. I asked myself, who are you? What do you like? What do you want to do with yourself? What brings you joy? And these were questions that I could not answer because the world had told me these things, right? The world had molded me into what I had become, and it was not of my doing at all. And
Yeah.
there's a great Carl Jung quote that says, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, it will tell you." Right?
I want to go
And
back. I
yeah,
want to go back,
good.
Laura, to your burnout and make a couple of comments. The first one being is that burnout's a word that we love to throw around, and a lot of people are overworked. And I'll admit to saying that I feel burnt out when I'm feeling a bit like probably worked a bit too hard for a couple of weeks. But sharing your story makes me realize the difference between actual burnout and just feeling overworked. The other thing I wanted to mention in the space of burnout is, it would make for a much more perfect story, I guess, that at that moment you realize that everything wasn't right. And after that incident, you quit, and that's when your life changed. I've experienced similar situation to you where that's the first wake up call, but for whatever reason, you're so conditioned to working a certain way, to being a certain way, that's only the first wake up call, and you still need further time to finally make a change. And so, on that note, what I wanted to talk about was, you know, doing what you thought you should, and can you sort of define to me what like should means to you?
Yeah, yeah. This varies by culture, by region, by family, by religion in some cases. In my case, you alluded to your upbringing as being, work hard, work hard. I was raised by a boomer grandmother, and her favorite phrase to me was get happy. Like, I don't care what you have to complain about, right? Also, I was raised in the southern United States. in the southeastern United States. That is an area of the world where still today women are expected to get married and have babies. That is still the role. Religion is a major, Christianity is a major part of the South. There are things that are influential in the marriage track, right? So when it comes to what I should do, I was raised to work hard, get a good education, get a good job, have a family, quit that job, take care of that family. And then when I'm an empty nester, okay, it's normal for empty nesters to need to reevaluate because they've lost themselves because the kids took their lives up. Well, that did not sound like anything that I wanted to do, but that's what I was conditioned to expect for myself. So I did it. I will tell you, I was 24 years old. I canceled my wedding. This is embarrassing 3 times because I knew in my soul that I did not want to be a corporate Southern housewife, right? A corporate housewife. How does that work, right? I'm the breadwinner and I'm taking care of the home. And that's just the expectation because in the Southern United States, still to this day, women are celebrated as becoming professionals, but there is no alleviation on the home responsibilities. And there's still an assumption that if you're a mother, right, you still need to figure out how to do everything at home and everything at work. And it's similar to the imbalance of the knowledge workers versus the physical labor. We're not quickly enough reconsidering our societal assignments, and we're still bulking people into masses as opposed to looking at the bio individual as their own entity that needs to be considered. And that's why I'm so passionate about coaching, because when I considered my coaching career, I really thought through because I was an executive and I was in that influential position, being a corporate, a professional coach. But what I realized from my own journey is that part of unbinding yourself from what you think you should be doing or a life that's taken its own control is questioning everything, right? And so I didn't want to help women understand if they're in the right corporate role. I wanted women to understand if fundamentally they want to be in the corporate world at all. So
It's
there's just this
interesting.
mismatch. Yeah.
It's really interesting, Laura. Actually, I'm reading a book. It's more in the context of because I've got a young family, and it's more in the context of raising young kids. It's called
Mhm.
Hunt, Gather, Parent. But she was mentioning about these sort of social norms that we have,
Mhm.
and in terms of the I guess the traditional mum stays at home and raises the kids. The interesting thing is, I have to be honest, there is part of me that was kind of led to believe that, maybe it's the very modern world. It's only the last 50 years that women have focused on their careers. And maybe the mum staying at home and raising the children was actually the natural right way. But actually, it turns out that historically, kids were raised by the whole village, like
Mhm.
I'm not just talking like grandparents and a few uncles. It's like you'd have you'd marry some sort of like distant cousin, and you'd have like godparents, and you'd have this huge village of people that would raise the kid. And
Mhm.
it was only in 600 AD that the Catholic Church started taking a hard line on incest, but not to the point of I don't want everyone listening to get creeped out and think, oh, look, we can all agree that marrying your first cousin's probably not a good idea. But in the
Yeah.
context of what was happening was most people were marrying someone that by genetics was like a sixth cousin, or they shared something like 0.001% of genes, and they were creating this community. But they essentially, the Catholic Church created the nuclear family, and then over time it became smaller and smaller, and so now that's sort of the classic American picture of the smiling family with the husband and wife and 2 kids and their white picket fence. It is genuinely a social construct, and really
That's right.
and back in, and you look at a lot of traditional cultures, mothers do go out and work, And yes, they don't necessarily go and work in a corporate office. They go and work in more sort of like related to the real world type things. But we've been conditioned so much to believe that that's what our society is about. And our podcast isn't about that, but I do like talking about these things because we are essentially, part of my job is to question these social norms because it's clearly not making us happy.
There's a reason we have the phrase, it takes a village. And I will pull this back to that mentality though, being in these very specific nations that are hyper focused on productivity, right? Because one of the first things that I do when I feel overwhelmed is I go to India. It's kind of my thing. But when I'm in India, I have friends that all live in nearby each other, and legitimately one of the ladies would just bring her baby every day and hand it to the collection of women, and she would go off and that's it. And then she comes back at the end of the day, and all of the women have been passing the baby around. She'd have to say, "Hey, who has the baby now?" And that community, in this case specifically, it was a community of women, but those communities do exist in other cultures, right? And there are still lots of cultures that do operate like that together, but you simply don't see that in these nations that pride themselves on productivity over humanity, dare I say.
And the compounding effect of that situation you just described is compared to the sort of typical Western thing where you have like the parents doting over the one child, you're actually more likely to raise a more balanced human being that's less self-centered, less narcissistic, and
Amen.
more likely to want to contribute to a community, as opposed to where sort of like it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because now you have a generation of kids that are raised to believe that they're this unique individual, that they're great and they're amazing, and they've been told their whole life that they're great and they're amazing, and so they're going to go out into the corporate world and be an amazing success. Whereas compared to the situation you described in India, you've got a child that has naturally realizes that mum's got other responsibilities other than her, and she's also got other people to rely on. So in some ways also going to be a more confident individual because they're not just relying on one or two adults to get their approval.
So right, the children become more well-rounded, right? And also, I am not a parent, so I hesitate to weigh in heavily on this subject, but modeling is so critically important. Our children are swimming in our energy all day long, right? And, as much as I understand the parent that hands the iPad and says, "Oh, I just need a minute for me." Oh my goodness, I have so much empathy for that need. But the reality is that you are about 3 steps beyond a foundation that could have prevented that need, right? Like the iPad is now part of the child's ingrained self soothing
Yeah,
system,
it's terrible, isn't
right?
it?
And so, but if you model other behaviors of self soothing yourself, then that's the energy your children swim in, and they can actually keep themselves regulated, become better members of society. We see less mental illness in these children that have this basis of self-care and modeled behavior from parents around health of the self, right? Like we think about health, but we still think about it for the collective in a lot of cases. I find especially women have a hard time turning that to themselves and saying, ooh, 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 okay, the kids need this, my husband needs this, work needs this, da 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 da. What do I need? Oh, it doesn't matter because there's no time. And that's the habit that I want to break. I want to create a world where mom says, I am going to model for you that this is critically important for my health, right? From an early age. Um, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think at a risk of this turning into too much of a conversation around parenting, Laura, in terms of your career. So I know you mentioned the burnout, that big moment in the hotel room. Well, I assume it was a hotel room. That was how I envisaged it. But anyway,
Yeah.
what was the point that made you finally say, no, enough's enough? And can you sort of explain what happened after that?
Yeah, yep. So as I hinted to, in the insane fashion, I stayed in the job for the next 4 years. And do you know, I I'm almost a little embarrassed to say this, but it is part of my story. And if you erase my story, you erase me. I actually ended up at an agency that was extremely focused on the bottom line. And I had left an agency that I loved, BBDO, working on the Home Depot, to come to this other agency and invest in what they were trying to build. And 11 months went by, and they couldn't match the salary that I had. So at the end of the 12 months, 1 year, I was like, yes, I'll come and improve myself. At the end of the 1 year, there was supposed to be a financial bonus. And at the end of the 11 months, unfortunately, because a few other people had lost some accounts in the agency, they couldn't afford that bonus. And instead of having a real conversation with me and saying, hey, here's the situation, let's work something out, which I would have been completely open to, they terminated me. And that moment, I realized it doesn't matter how much I put into this. I will still be a number.
Yep.
In advertising, everybody says, look, everybody's replaceable, right? Because there's so much churn and burn in that industry. And I had always been in a position in my career where I had made a seat at the table for myself. In case you can't tell, I'm pretty outgoing. And in that moment, it was basically saying everything that you've brought forward isn't going to be enough, right? Pouring everything in. And I was immediately thrown back to the physical sickness that I had been experiencing. And it was just a moment of this isn't worth my one life. There has to be another way. And so I left. I do still do some freelancing because we have to pay the bills.
Yes, 100%. Yep.
And, as you're building a coaching business and
Yep.
trying to, build a brand online, it takes time.
Yeah, and I'm in a similar scenario too. It's completely normal.
Hmm.
Like you can't you
Right.
can't just like burn the boats unless you're very lucky financially.
That's right. That's right. But it is about slowing down. And that's the thing that I just really want to echo out is I was not able to reground myself and figure out what I needed and wanted until I slowed down enough to pay attention to it. And that seems so simple when we're talking about it. But the reality is when you are in the whirlwind of the day to day and you're just trying to get that to-do list done, again, stepping away to eat lunch outside as opposed to at your desk is impossible. So, in what world are you going to sit down and consider of a list of 100 values, which three resonate most with you? Right. And so that's what I want to help people do is spend a little time investing in understanding, getting to know themselves. Because I would bet the vast majority of people on with a quick ask wouldn't be able to tell you their favorite color or their favorite cuisine or what makes them the happiest, right? I remember one day I was, this is after I was let go from the agency and feeling so defeated. And my dog was playing in the park and he was running at me and his ears were bouncing and he had this smile on his face. And I just felt the world lift off of my shoulders. And I told my therapist about that the next morning, and she goes, do you know what that is? And I said, what? And she goes, that was joy. It was just pure, simple joy. And I didn't even know that the thing that makes me most joyful is playing in the park with my dog. I had to stumble and fall into the mud to discover it because I had never considered taking the time to figure out who I was and what I needed.
A few weeks ago, we talked about creating space. Space to recover, space to rest, space to discover who we really are. As we continue to dive deeper into self-awareness, this week, it's about reflecting on your life from the other end of your life. Death. The great inevitable for each and every one of us is that at some point we're going to die. In the context of your career, I know this might be a grim thing to think about, but if we don't address this inevitability, we will never live a life true to ourselves. And we know that one of the most common regrets people have on their deathbeds is this: I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not what others expected of me. How does Laura now live a life true to herself?
It comes down to freedom. And as an American, I will preface that with not that kind of freedom. Okay. But freedom is just to me, the ability to control your own narrative, right? You get to make your own choices based off of what's best for you. So many things in this world make us feel trapped. And I found that my personal value, when it came down to it, was this sense that I was free to leverage my time to create. And in order to do that, I had to shrink my to-do list, right? And give myself that space. And so it takes hard decisions, right? Right now, because I do not want to hustle my way into this new profession. I want to evolve my way into this new profession. There are things that I have to give up. That advertising salary allowed me to own a home that I can no longer responsibly afford. And that is okay with me, because freedom is so much more. The freedom to build this business and create and help other people is so much more important to me than the box I live inside. But it took me the past year to reconcile that. I was like a Jekyll and a Hyde, because I was so accustomed to this lifestyle, this comfortable lifestyle where I didn't have to worry about pulling out my credit card to pick up dinner for friends or whatever. And now all of a sudden I am beyond paycheck to paycheck. But that's okay, because also selling my house is a choice that I got to make to fuel the next chapter of my life. And all of that comes back down to freedom, right? And again, that's my personal value, but I also believe that I am sitting in the seat that a lot of people, especially women in productive countries that celebrate productivity, are really just
Yeah.
they're not taking the time to find their freedom.
Yes. So the final question for today, Laura, I've really appreciated our conversation. It's been very enjoyable. You've got so much energy. You actually remind me of a previous guest I have, and I'm going to connect you with that person. But
Oh, please.
my final question for today, and it's a closing tradition of this podcast, is what is the one tip you would give to 25-year-old you?
Slow down. Life is moving really quickly. And, when we are in our 20s, we see no end, right? Everything is possible. There's nothing but time and resources. So we start to gobble up all of those resources. And before we know it, those resources are driving the ship. And so I would say to my 25-year-old self, slow down, listen to what your body is telling you, right? And ask deeper questions. Don't just accept that this is what you need to do because this is what you need to do. Ask yourself, is this what I need to do to get myself to my goal, my objective, my dream? And if you don't know what that dream is, then that's an even bigger indicator that you might be at risk of living somebody else's narrative. But until you slow down, it's hard to recognize that.
That was Laura Robichaux, a corporate dropout turned holistic coach. She specialises in helping women recover from burnout. You can find out more about Laura at bywayofgrey.com. 3 take-homes from today's episode. 1. Everything that's expected in modern society is a social construct. And the rules we live by are mostly relatively new in human history. 2. The quote I think Laura meant to reference was this: if you listen to your body when it whispers, you won't have to hear it when it screams. This comes back to why self-awareness is such an important part of your early career journey. It also allows you to hear those small whispers of what you really want, so you don't reach your 50s screaming for a change, aka the midlife crisis. 3. Finally, Laura recommends you go slow. This isn't about being lazy or half-assed. It's about treating your career as a marathon, not a sprint. Because if you treat your career like a sprint, it might look good on the outside, but you'll inevitably burn out. This week's challenge? Identify your standout moments.
Challenge accepted.
The theme of this week is listening to your life. And in the vein of the quote I just mentioned, listening actually includes listening to your life. Your past experiences. Going back as far as you remember, those moments when you were your truest, most authentic self. Write down those moments in your life when you truly stood out from the crowd. Not just external success, but where you were internally fulfilled as well. Were you the kid who led from the front? The kid who always sorted conflicts amongst your friends? Or the kid who stood out in a particular subject or activity? When did you stand out from the crowd? And what are the common themes from these moments? So this week, identify your standout moments.
Challenge accepted.
Thanks for listening to Escape the 9 to 5. Again, if you're enjoying the show and finding it valuable in your career, go ahead and hit the follow button on whatever app you're listening on. This helps the show in more ways than you know, and the bigger the show grows, the better experience you will get. I'm Dr. Steve Oily, your host, and thanks for being part of our movement. See you next time.